Welcome to the program. Lyman Stone joins us today. He's a PhD candidate in sociology at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, in the population dynamics specialization. He researches fertility preferences and factors impacting the realization of those preferences, including survey methodologies. In particular, he analyzes what people actually mean by the reports they give about their family dispositions in demographic and social surveys, assessing the role of explicit values, socializing influences, normative ecologies, response biases, implicit or unconscious schemas, and other factors. He also assesses what kinds of social, structural, and policy factors mediate the relationship between those survey statements and people's ultimate family outcomes. He's also interested in historical demography, critical demography, studies of contraception and abortion, and family demography at large. He received a BA in economics from Transylvania University in 2013 and a master's in international trade and investment policy from the George Washington University Elliott School for International Affairs in 2015. His current affiliations include his role as Director of Research for the consulting firm Demographic Intelligence and Senior Fellow at the Canadian faith-based think tank Cardis and Research Fellow at the Charlottesville, Virginia-based Institute for Family Studies. We thought it was very important to talk about this issue of declining fertility rates around the world and in westernized countries like the United States and Canada from an academic point of view. So much of our conversation has focused in the public around people's preferences, but we haven't really talked about what are the factors influencing those preferences. And I thought, who better to talk to than somebody who studies this for a living from an academic point of view, from a research-based point of view. And layering on top of it, I thought it was important to talk to somebody who also looks at this at the intersection of society, demographics, and the role that religion plays in people's lives and the decisions that they make, specifically around family, but also about where they live and what they do for a living and how they think about the family structure differently based on those religious traditions or non-religious traditions. So I hope you have a open mind to this conversation, because unfortunately in some countries, and more recently in the United States, this issue of fertility rates has, like so many other things, become politicized. But I don't think we need to look at this through a political lens. I think it's much more valuable to look at this through a more academic and research-based lens. And I think we can learn a lot about the factors influencing people's decision. At the end of this interview, I have a couple of thoughts on this, but I think it's important that we hear from Lyman first. We spent about 45 minutes together talking about as many aspects of this issue as we could in the time given. I learned a lot from this, and I think it's a very objective and very thoughtful conversation starter. And I hope that you share this with your family, your friends, and those who you might be having these discussions about, to get some of the politics out of it, at least in the United States. And for those where this is not a political issue, to just start the conversation around the changing thoughts and dynamics of what we think of when we think of fertility, when we think of family formation, and when we think of the ideal life that so many people want to have. So, with that preview, it is my honor to present to you my conversation with Lyman Stone. Lyman, welcome to the program.
It's really good to be with you.
So I've given an introduction, but nobody can introduce themselves like themselves. So just give our audience a quick background and what brought you into the research that you pursue today.
My name is Lyman. I'm a demographer. That means I study people, and particularly I study very tiny people, babies, why people have them, why they don't, why they want them or not, and what kinds of factors shape that. People ask me how I got into it. I by accident. I actually was working on other things, and then I started occasionally dabbling and like writing about fertility stuff, and then I found that it was way more interesting, and it got and people were interested in it, and so I just kind of did more and more of it until now. It's now all I do. So I walked backwards into it, but sometimes serendipity leads you to a very satisfying result.
Well, and you stumbled into a specific area that everybody seems to want to talk about now, which
Yep.
is babies and people having them or not having them, and all the influences in society around it. So, what we read about a lot in at least the Western world is a general decline in fertility rates, people having fewer kids, some people having no kids. And parallel to this, we also hear that there's less active participation in organized religion in the traditional sense of, your Sunday services or whatever your denominations are. And so I'm curious, from your research and from the way you're looking at this, do you see a linkage between these two things? Is one potentially having an impact on the other, or are these parallel trends that just happen to be coinciding at this time?
So they're not it's not a coincidental correlation, right? Like it is true that religious people have a lot more children. That's true. Um, Certainly in all the countries where Abrahamic religion is dominant. That's not true in Buddhist countries, maybe not as much in Confucian ones. Um, I should also mention that like Christians in Taiwan or Korea don't necessarily have more kids. So it's not so much like Christianity or something. It's like something about like Christian cultural milieu, right? Um, Causes Abrahamic people to have more kids. Um, then uh, and so as irreligion is rising, or rather as particular forms of non-theistic religion rise, um, uh, we find falling fertility. Okay, so that sounds like secularism is causing falling fertility, but it's not that simple, because when you actually look at who fertility is falling among, yes, there is a compositional shift in societies from religious to secular, and that pushes down fertility. But we actually observed that the biggest decline in fertility is among secular people, right? So like the fertility gap between religious and secular people is actually getting bigger and bigger. Now we do also see a decline among religious people. So there is a compositional shift. But I know the US data best on this, but there's actually something similar happening in some European countries as well. Um, and there's something happening in Islamic countries too, particularly in like the Gulf states, where we actually see a decline among highly religious people. So there is this compositional shift. There's also some great research out of the Netherlands that shows that like religious people have more kids when they're surrounded by other people who share their convictions. So like religion is a community experience, and if you're not surrounded by that community, it's harder to get the family and fertility benefits. Um, so yeah, I mean, secularization is part of this, but it's not the whole story, because we observe a particularly sharp decline among secular people, which is especially weird since a lot of those secular people are formerly religious, and so they like still have some of those like they still have the baggage of Christianity, so to speak. um, uh, but we also see a decline among religious people. And we know from the case of some Eastern religions that there's not an intrinsic connection between like spiritual ideas and fertility. It's specific elements of specific religious communities.
So we've talked about that it's not a direct link between religious engagement and the size of families necessarily, though there may be some linkage there. But what are some of the other factors that are playing into whether people are choosing to have children or not? And one topic that I have been discussing with people is the network effect, that religious communities tend to have more people in them. If not your direct family, you are part of a larger community tied together by church. And through that, you find childcare and economic support at times and other forms of emotional support. And those who are not tied to a religious community maybe find that in different places, but it tends to be a smaller network. So, could something like that be a factor that is not directly tied to your faith, but indirectly how you live your life? Has a result that then influences what you do with your family planning.
Yeah, so a really strong predictor of like going on to have a second child or a third child or a fourth, whatever, is what's called alloparental support. Allo meaning other, so other parent meaning other people in your life pretending to be parents for your kids. So providing you free childcare, basically. And religious people give way more free childcare than non-religious people, and they also receive way more free childcare. Um, this is something religious communities tend to do for each other because they see themselves as a community. They see children born in that community as someone they have a stake in, and so they invest in those kids. So religious communities have more alloparental investment in non-kin children. They invest in each other's children because they see them as kin-like. Also, religious communities tend to be homogamous, that is, they marry each other, and so parents of children tend to see other children in the community as plausible candidate future relatives, so to speak. I mean, we say it as a joke. Like I have daughters, I have three little daughters, and I'm like all my friends with sons. I'm like, hey, maybe they'll get married. Like it's a joke, but also it's like, no, I mean, they really could. Like it's not implausible. Um, so that's one factor in religious communities, and that, in theory, can be replicated in secular communities, right? They could invest in each other's kids in these ways. In practice, it wouldn't really work, right? Because like the reason that religious people, particularly Abrahamic people who come from religions that tend to have particular kinds of beliefs about the afterlife, um, the reason that we invest in our kids in this way is because we actually think that there's like this kinship of spirit, kinship of faith that makes a real stake in those kids. I don't do it because I'm a nice guy, is what I'm saying, right? There's actually I don't want to call it selfish motivation, but there's an instrumental utility to investing in other people's kids. So that would it could be replicated, but it's hard. Now, that's not the only reason religious people have higher fertility, though. The other one is marriage markets, right? Most people value homogamy across a range of traits. Particularly, people really disprefer marrying folks with different sexual and family norms and preferences as they have, right? So, like, if you want an exclusive marriage and somebody else likes to have sex with people they're not married to, even when they're married, you don't want to marry each other. It'll be very unhappy. Likewise, if you do want kids and they don't, that's the type of thing people tend to talk about before getting married. So, you know, religious communities solve a matching problem, right? They organize people around sexual and family values. I mean, this is one of the central elements of any religious faith is values about sex and family. And so, because religions efficiently sort people on sex and family values, they more efficiently match people into mating. So religious people get married younger, and their younger marriages do not have elevated divorce risk. Whereas for secular people, divorce risk declines with age at marriage. For religious people, it does not. The younger marriages, assuming we're not talking about child marriages, okay, we're talking about like adults, but these relatively youthful adult marriages are just as stable as somewhat older ones for religious people. And then finally, the other reason religious people have more kids is because they want more kids. Uh, so like there is like doctrinal, ideological, spiritual beliefs motivate different ideal family sizes. So you know, alloparenting could be replicated. Efficient marriage matching much harder to replicate because secular people are in some sense defined by like not feeling bound to a specific creedal type of like sexual and religious norm. So that efficient matching system is very hard to replicate. And then third, you know, religion supplies motivations to alter your perceived hedonic benefit of being a parent and having kids. So, like, what's the secular narrative that is going to match that? Maybe there is one, but it doesn't yet seem to exist in the world in a compelling way.
So, do we, as we think about other factors that may be playing into this, we know that around the world over the last 100 plus years, we've seen an urbanization of populations. People who once lived in smaller towns, rural communities, now living in large population centers, largely for economic reasons. And some have said that that may be playing a role in people choosing to or not choosing to have kids because the environment is different than the one that they maybe were born in. It's having families that are split apart now, a grandparents' generation that lives still in the countryside, two generations down the line, they're working in the big city. And then, of course, just the underlying factors of being able to find communities when you're within a larger section. So, do you find, as a demographer, that location matters in this conversation as well about people's choices to have kids and their ability to retain their ties to a religious community?
It does. I mean, I mentioned there's good research on this from the Netherlands showing that like religious people in towns that are very secular do not have a fertility advantage, but religious people in towns that have larger communities of their shared faith have a fertility advantage. Um, and I think there's a deeper question here about when we talk about place, like what is a place? Well, there's policy exposures. Okay, if you live in a country that gives you more generous support for family, maybe you'll have a little more kids. There's real estate costs. If you live in a place where housing is really expensive, you're not going to have as many kids, and that's a big factor. Cities, dense population areas tend to have higher real estate costs per acre, so to speak. Um, so that's just a thing. Um, we could go on. Urbanization is so many different things. Like historically, urbanization is related to industrialization, state formation, educational expansion, all these formalization of work, all these different things that it's difficult even to talk about like what is urbanization, um, but yeah, place matters. Move people around, they'll have different amounts of babies. Um, Now, the main reason for that, in my view, is what we talked about: is community, right? The kinds of peers you're surrounded by are different. The amount of social support you have access to in your social group is different. That peer effect is really important too, because fertility behaviors are socially contagious. Um, People tend to learn from their peers what is good, viable, and possible. Um, and I think that this actually points to an underlying factor in a lot of modern fertility dynamics, which is basically the erosion of physical in-person community, um, the type of community where you might hold a friend's baby, um, and the expansion of non-physical community, a type of community that's aligned basically purely on kind of like verbality, like just how you write and talk, how you present yourself in words or sometimes images, um, and that this may have really separated people from functional community that can actually support the deeply like in-person experience of parenting, um, and may also have given rise to kind of an like a warp speed increase in adverse mental health. And I should mention that one of the single strongest predictors of low birth rates or of low odds of having children at the individual level is just diagnosis with a mood or behavioral disorder. So like there's a nice study out of Finland and Sweden that uses like the complete universe of all medical records in these countries, and they show that um, a a facility visit, so like a hospitalization or rehab facility or something like that for a mood or behavioral disorder. So this is like severe depression in this case, has the same effect on childlessness as like a severe congenital deformity, like like the types of things that would render people actually infertile. Um, so I think we can assume pretty safely that we also see in other data that more moderate mental ill health um, also has a significant, though not quite as severe, negative effect on fertility. And so that interrelates with religion. It's not the same thing, but there's obviously a connection there with religion and community and how our lives are all getting weird as they're all online.
So, as a demographer, do you look at healthy birth rates as a sign of a healthy nation, a healthy country, in the sense that if you're having a lot of kids, it would indicate that mental health scores are probably better, physical health scores are probably better, community bonds are probably better? Is this a fair way for us to be measuring a society?
No, I wouldn't put it that simply. So, if I see that there's a country where people are having 9 kids per woman, um, my next question is, okay, how many kids do they want to have per woman? And if the answer is 9, okay, that sounds pretty healthy to me. These people really want a lot of kids and they're having them. But if the answer is 3 and they're having 9, to me that says either a lot of people are experiencing coercion, or serious poverty, or the rate of child death is so high they feel they have to have 9 to get the 3 they want. None of those are good results. um, so, but it is the case, I think, that when you see a country where the fertility rate is close to what people say they want, that is a good sign. And in the US right now, the average woman can expect to have half a child less than she says she wants, which is another way of saying every other woman will be missing a child that she wants. Um, that's a substantial gap. That is an indictment. The gap is actually even larger in many European countries, and it's even larger in East Asia. That I do see as an important barometer of community health.
It's a really important point because I think as this gets talked about more in the public consciousness, there's been sort of a perception that the reason that there are fewer kids in Western societies is because women want fewer kids. But your research would indicate that's not necessarily true. They may want as many kids as they've ever wanted, but for other reasons, they're not able to find the partners. They're not able to conceive, they're not able to successfully carry through the pregnancy. So that's a fascinating just nugget right there, is that some of the assumptions being made about why the fertility rates are down are not right. This isn't
Yep.
people saying, "Oh, I don't want kids." It are there are other factors. What do you feel is the leading of those factors? Is it more of a matching issue, a biological issue? What are the factors that are preventing a woman who say has the ideal of a family of 3 or 4, but only ends up with one? What are some of the leading causes of that?
The biggest factor is partnership. So if marriage is coming later, and for an increasing number of people, it's not coming at all. This is The reality is most people, even if they're most people want to raise a child with a partner. Ideally, a committed partner, a partner who is homogamous on certain important traits, is a peer in certain ways, treats them like a peer in a variety of ways. Um, so that can be hard to find, and especially as various tools for efficient matching have gone by the wayside, and as in-person community declines, and that's the community where you're overwhelmingly most likely to find a mate, in terms of like your mate success chance per interaction. Um, so uh, Declining marriage, declining coupling is definitely the single biggest factor. Then you have to ask, why is that declining? It's like an infinite regress of whys, right? So, well, then you get on like educational timelines and work history timelines, changing norms about partnership, like I said, the loss of efficient matching mechanisms, increasing diversity in society that makes it more complicated to find someone who is homogamous on valued traits, a growing number of specific traits that are seen as like essential, right? So it's no longer your partner just needs to like, if you're a woman, you want your man to just earn a certain amount and blah blah. No, it's like he also needs to be these other things. Like, and same for a man. The list of requirements is growing. That just makes efficient matching more difficult. Um, so I'm not saying like lower your standards to raise the birth rate, but this is a real problem, and we need to be thinking seriously about, okay, um, which standards are really important, which ones are not. How do we help people match across increasingly complex and multifaceted standards? And how do we help them do so earlier? Because to be clear, most people want, like, current average marriage ages are higher than people say they want for themselves. So, like, people want to get married younger than they are. Um, the So how we do that is a complicated problem. So marriage is the biggest one. Then there's other things like housing costs that are rising in lots and lots of countries. Um, And then there are lots of other factors, and in each country there's a different story as well. I mean, fertility decline in India is a very different beast than fertility decline in Qatar, which is a very different beast than in Finland versus the U.S. I mean, we're going to be talking about really different specific instantiations of these kinds of problems. Um, and I mean, yeah, I mean, I could go on a lot about India and Qatar, but I will, in the interest of time, I will not go down that
Maybe another episode.
too much. There you go.
So we made an assumption earlier that I should actually validate. I had said that the perception is that there's a lot less active participation in what we would refer to as organized religion. I think that's backed up by some data, but there's a lot of informal religious observations and celebrations. People who maybe don't go to the synagogue or to the mosque or to the church on the weekend, but they still live a life with the same values they were raised with. They just maybe don't participate in all of the traditions. So let me validate that with you. Do you see a decline, a meaningful statistical decline in active participation in religious communities? Or is this a big assumption that we're all making?
No, there's definitely a decline. I mean, at least in the West. In other countries, the story is not quite as clear. But certainly in the West, there's declining participation and interest in religion. Globally, there's actually increasing religiosity, even though in most countries religiosity is declining. And the reason for this is just that the countries that have population growth, even though within country they may have declining religiosity, um, they are still above the global average, and so they have rapid population. So, like you think about a country like Nigeria, or Tanzania or something. So,
So let's talk a little bit now about the consequences of this, because we've had guests on this program before who've talked about it in like the geopolitical sense, and we've talked a little bit about what it could mean economically, but spiritually, culturally, declining birth rates are going to have impacts in a very practical way beyond even the big macroeconomic or geopolitical picture. So, as a demographer, what are some of the red flags that you're concerned about? Is this a cycle that just kind of keeps going? If a family is small and they're producing only one or two children, and then the next generation produces even fewer, and then we reach a generation where we're not producing any, like, are we in sort of a demographic death spiral here, or do you believe that this is a point in time that we've gone through before and that we're likely to actually come out of it and get back to a more stable reproductive rate?
um, I don't think humanity is going to go extinct because we forgot how to have babies. Um, so yeah, we'll come out of it somehow. Um, but that won't be because we just drift into high fertility. It will be because various communities, countries, peoples, whatever, make choices to institute uh, policies, practices, norms, institutions, whatever, that support bigger family size. Um, so, in terms of what it will do to people to be in a society of very low fertility, I think the first thing is just to remember that like people don't want low fertility. So you can rephrase it as, what will it mean for people to live in a society where their life experiences are increasingly distant from their life aspirations? Okay. It's just going to be a society of more frustration, disappointment, and feeling betrayed and let down by the world. Um, that's not going to be a pleasant society. That's going to be a much angrier society. Um, you can also think, what happens to someone when they have a kid? We know that in general they tend to become more religious when they have children. They tend to become somewhat more conservative in general values, though not on economic issues, I should say. Um, they tend to invest in different types of peer relationships, so less with just like friends and more with you know teachers, neighbors, like these other kind of you could almost say like formalized relationships. So you have a shift in the types of relationships that are invested in. Um, and of course, when people become parents, they increase investment not only in their own children, but in other people's children. So like their kids' friends, right? Their kids' classmates, people in their kids' peer age group, these types of things. So, what will it be to be in a society where there are fewer people investing in other people's children? Because that's also where we're heading. Because parenting is what motivates a lot of those investments. Um, a world where the average kid, you might think with fewer people having kids, the average kid would have more adults involved in their life. And that's true. They will have like more grandparent time, but they will actually have less like uncle time, right? Uh, and less like friends' parents time, so to speak. So it's an interesting dynamic where like you get more grandparent and less uncle and you know quote unquote uncle.
And in terms of where we think the society is going to go with government policy, this is a fascinating one to me because while I think governments can do a lot to suppress people from having kids, we've seen that in countries often to their detriment. Incentivizing people to have kids, I mean, we've seen governments around the world try to do this for quite some time, and so far it doesn't seem to be making a big difference. So, in your view, is there any particular political policy or government policy that really truly is effective in incentivizing it? Or is this just one of those issues that as a society we have to work through without really a significant role for public policy?
So if I reduce the price of hamburgers by 1%, how many more hamburgers do you think people will buy? Non-rhetorical question. Maybe
uh,
1% more,
1% more.
approximately.
Yeah.
Okay, right? People's like hamburger budget probably doesn't change in the aggregate. Okay,
Yeah.
so if you reduce, so this is what we call elasticities in economics, meaning how sensitive is the quantity of something to the price. If we see that quantity responds symmetrically to price, we would call that like a normal elasticity, meaning if you make it 1% cheaper, you get about 1% more. Most goods in our society are kind of approximately normal. Now, there's some things that are very insensitive to price, that you cut the price 50% and you don't get a lot more sales. Okay. People often have in their head that that's how fertility works. That, like, oh, the government, if they could cut the price a ton, but people still wouldn't change their behavior. Luckily, we have decades of really high quality studies leveraging quasi experimental variation to get at the causal effect of the price of a child on the number of children, where we can see that governments change the price of a child, that is, rearing a child to adulthood, by having a child tax credit or a child care program or whatever. And we can see the elasticity is around 1. If you cut the price of a child by 1%, you tend to get about 1% more kids. It's a normal elasticity. It's not an expensive thing relatively. The issue is, how much does a child cost? Well, in the US, when you add in the budgetary cost, that is things you pay for, the opportunity cost, that is things you give up to have a kid, and then also the costs that are actually already being paid for by your tax dollars, like public education, the total cost of raising a child to economic independence is somewhere between, for a middle class family, between $500,000 and $2 million. Okay? So let's say it's $1 million for simplicity. So what would it take to reduce the cost of having a child by 1%? Well, a $10,000 right up front baby bonus. Okay. So if you wanted to raise US fertility from 1.6 to 1.62, okay, a $10,000 baby bonus. That's a big expenditure. But the point isn't that the policy, that like childbearing doesn't respond to policy. It does. It's just that the social norm of what you need to provide a child is so expensive. Okay. Um, Now, there are ways to reduce costs without a budgetary outlay, things like reducing housing costs by allowing more construction of homes, um, things like reducing occupational licensing so people can get into careers faster, um, these sorts of things. You could also consider like the social prevalence of children, ways to try and enable more efficient matching. There's all kinds of interventions you could think about. But the key point I wanted to make is like, let's say you had to boost fertility only through throwing money at it. This would be very expensive, but how expensive would it be really? One way we could think about is to say, okay, you have a baby. Let's say the baby lives 70 years. Um, let's say it costs $1 million to get an extra baby, which implies kind of a normal elasticity. That's about $15,000 spent per year of life for the baby. Is that cheap or expensive? Well, that's way less than the statistical value of life. And that's way cheaper than if you wanted to add one more year of life through Medicaid in the US or Medicare, right? Pronatalism gets you more human life years per dollar spent than most government policies that are aimed at increasing human life years. It's more efficient spending than most public health programs are. Now, this is a weird calculation because like preventing someone who lives from dying is quite different from preventing someone who's born from like, this is different. I'm not going to say like, this should be your barometer for all decisions in life. No, that's like weird utilitarian nonsense. But it is like on some level, it is informative for our ideas about cost. No one thinks it's weird to be dropping like huge shares of the total economy on like helping old people live one more life, one more year, even though old people are not economically productive anymore. Like no one thinks that's weird to do. And to be clear, I don't think that's weird to do. Like it's good to help old people live longer. But suddenly when you say, well, maybe we should spend money to help young people exist, they're like, oh, well, that sounds expensive. Like all I'm saying is make subsidies for families as big as subsidies for old people. Okay, I want the child tax credit to be the same share of GDP as Social Security and Medicare. So like 10% of the economy should just be dropped into parents' pockets every year. Okay. I know that this sounds crazy, but like, why is it crazy? The only reason it's crazy is because we've internalized the idea that parents should have to bear the entire cost of perpetuating civilization. That's why it sounds crazy. It's because we believe that on some level. But if we were to say, actually, civilization should collectively bear the cost of perpetuating itself, then that would imply that we are spending just incredibly small amounts on families compared to where we should be. Now, if we did this, would fertility rise to 2.1? No. It might rise 0.2 or 0.3 children per woman, which would be hundreds of thousands of extra babies per year in the US, and over decades would be tens of millions higher total population. Okay, France started doing this in the 1920s and 30s, and there are between 3 and 13 million extra French people today because of those policies. France shifted from a declining share of population in Europe to a growing share because of fertility policies. That's a success. So I resist the idea that like policy can't do much. The reason policy can't do much is because policymakers refuse to actually seriously consider the magnitude of the issue and think about the idea that children who do not yet exist might be worthwhile for society in a similar way as the other groups of people that we spend enormous amounts of money supporting.
So to tie it back with where we started on this, where do you see the roles of the modern organized religious organizations without having to go through the formality of the policies we've talked about here, which may be part of the long-term solutions? But what can religious communities, religious groups do, in your view, to bring more people back into the fold, which might help to supplement some of what you're talking about from a policy perspective and bring, a little bit more of what brought the higher fertility rates in the past because of their ties through community, through religion? So we've talked about what the government could do. What could some of these religious institutions do to help?
Uh, Religious institutions, so there's two different questions there. What can religious institutions do to draw people back into themselves? And then what can they do to support birth rates? The second one is simpler. they can forthrightly tell people to have babies. There's a lot of research on what happens when a religious leader tells their people have babies. The answer is they have more babies. Like point blank, that's what happens. So religious organizations, if they care about this, can exhort, encourage, and then materially support fertility. They can do a better job of coordinating alloparenting within their communities, and also connecting young people and young families to various resources. Maybe there's a retiree living in a 5-bedroom house alone who would love to have a family with a young child live with them. I know some families in that situation right now where there was an older person in the community who needed someone living with them to help them, but still had some independence. And so a family with young kids moved in. The retiree, the old person, got little kids running around the house, the joy of young children around, and the family got like dramatically, essentially free housing. Um, so there's a lot of this that could be done if religious communities are willing to say, hey, we think this is normal, we think this is good, we encourage this, we will help you deal with the transaction cost of matching into these kinds of relationships. So that's something that religious communities can do. They can forthrightly speak to the good, the excellence of having children and parenting, and they can assist people in overcoming the social matching problems related to housing and childcare and marriage. In terms of what they can do to draw people to themselves, I actually think some of the answer is the same thing, that religions thrive when they offer clear benefits. Like when people see what the value proposition is. And I know that sounds gross, like unspiritual. Like, oh, but I'm not saying like, oh, you got to market it, but I'm saying like fundamentally, humans come to believe things because they practice them, right? Belief is downstream of habitus. And so if religions want people to believe what they teach, they need to first demonstrate to people that the implications of what they teach yield a life that's good, worthy, and admirable. Okay? So if you want this to be the case, then, start doing these things that help people connect to the goals they have in life that they are not attaining. If people want to get married, they want to have kids, they want to do these things, they're not achieving them. And if religions have a pathway to that that's viable and cost effective and helps people get to that, man, lean into that. like lean into that, and people will see and they'll go, oh, maybe I want to be part of that community. And then they'll be like, why do people in this community behave this way? Oh, because they believe these things. Maybe I should believe these things. Okay, so that's what I would say, is that on both fronts, religions really need to more forthrightly um, focus on delivering the goods.
So we'll wrap with this. I always like to talk with folks like you about what questions that you're still exploring that maybe are not well researched yet, or things that you've seen that are interesting that we're not talking about in the public discourse. So as you look ahead and you think about where your research is going and questions that you have, I'm curious, what's the next chapter in this story that has yet to be told and you suspect we'll be talking about maybe a year from now or a couple of years from now?
So housing and marriage are big ones. We don't know to what extent fertility can be modified by major interventions in housing markets. Things like the YIMBY movement to upzone and build a lot more housing, or things like that, or changes in the type of housing you build. So that's one area we need a lot more research. I'm doing research in that, but we need a lot more. Second area is marriage. We know married people have way more kids. We have reason to believe this is probably at least somewhat causal. Um, but um, um, but we don't know for sure if policies that would incentivize marriage would generate similar fertility rates for the additional marriages that are incentivized. So this is an area we need research. We need scholars exploring these questions, and they're difficult questions to explore because there isn't that much policy variation on them. But these are definitely major areas that we need to know more.
We'll
And
be
I should
listening.
say these are the areas that we're focusing on exploring at the Pronatalism Initiative, this project that I'm a director of, is we're trying to find ways to tackle these questions and find researchers who want to work on them.
Well, then we'll have to have you back as you get that research in and you start having some of those answers. We'd love to hear them here. Um, is there any particular place that folks who'd like to learn more about you can do so? A website, a social media channel?
You can always follow me on Twitter, Lyman Stone KY. I guess I should say you can follow me on X. Um, you'll find that my Twitter content is very eclectic, but there is eventually birth stuff in there usually. So
Excellent. And we'll put a link to that in the description of this program. Lyman, this has been a fascinating conversation. We hope to have you back for additional dialogue. Maybe we'll go back and circle back on those issues in Qatar and India at some point. But for now, thank you for taking the time to walk through this very important topic.
my pleasure. Good talking to you.
The issue of declining fertility is not a new one. This has been discussed in countries around the world for many years, in some cases decades, as countries from Russia to Japan to some of our Western European brothers and sisters and other countries around the world have experienced declining rates of fertility. And there have been tons of public conversations and lots of research around this topic. And most of it was from an economic point of view. It was focused on the idea that as societies get wealthier, the women in those societies have more access to information, knowledge, birth control, health care. And as families get wealthier, they just need fewer children, and they have fewer children. And as women gain more freedoms, they have more choices, and they may not choose to have the sixth or the seventh child. Maybe they stop at 2, or they stop at 3, or they decide not to have children at all. So there's been a very specific conversation around the context of economic viability and increasingly wealthy societies and declining birth rates in association with that. This has generally been viewed as a positive thing, that declining birth rates to a point are a benefit because they're showing that a society is getting wealthier, that child survival rates are increasing. And so therefore people don't find the need to have the 7th or the 8th or the 9th child because they fear they're going to lose 2 or 3 of them before they become mature adults. And because they don't live in a subsistence poverty environment where children are equivalent to labor at the farm or labor at home. So that's been the context of this conversation globally for quite a long time, and it was neither viewed as a good thing or a bad thing, but it was viewed as a challenge for societies who were not replacing their elder generations, and these societies and the whole world, frankly, in most of the world, is becoming older, faster, and we don't have as much of a young population to be able to contribute economically to sustain those older populations. But I thought it was important in this conversation, and in the context of the public dialogue around fertility rates, to look at it from a little bit of a different angle. And I'm really glad that we got to what we got to today with Lyman, because there is this idea that fertility rates have simply dropped in Western Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in many countries around the world, simply because childbearing women choose to have fewer children. And it's exclusively a choice, and it's an intentional choice. And that it's driven exclusively by the desire to have children later in life, to pursue other non-childbearing goals earlier in life. But what you heard from Lyman in his research, and frankly, what a lot of us who just have the conversation with our peer group, with our family members, with people in our community, it's much more complicated than that. And the part of the research that I really like that Lyman pursues is this difference between what surveys can pick up when they ask very generalized questions about what's happening in your family and your preferences, and what's left unsaid. So one thing that a survey has a hard time picking up, or used to have a hard time picking up, it can pick up how many kids you have. It can pick up the pace with which you and the society had kids, but it didn't really ask, how many did you want? And there's this theory that we simply have fewer children because women and married couples and others just want fewer kids. The data and some of Lyman's research and some other research that's now much more readily available to us says otherwise. A lot of the research would indicate that Couples actually don't want fewer kids. Individuals don't necessarily want fewer kids. It is the conditions in which they are living today that simply make it difficult for them to achieve their goals of having the size of the family that they ideally would like to have. And this includes women, many of whom report they would love to have a family of 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 kids, but they're not having any. Not by choice necessarily, but by the fact they're having a hard time finding the right mate. They're having a hard time affording even the basic needs to raise a child, including decent housing in a safe community. And we're hearing that it's just getting harder to do that earlier in life. So it's not that people don't want to have kids. In fact, I can argue that the pace of this is not significantly different now than it ever was before. There's a pretty good case to be made, a pretty good argument to be made, that people want as many kids now as they ever did. Women want to have as many, men want to produce as many heirs, that this is not necessarily a big societal change that 100 years ago people wanted 8 kids and now they only want, 2. People had to have those 8 or 9 kids for economic reasons in the past, and people may only be having 1 or no kids now, also for economic reasons. So it's a very different lens to look at this issue through. It's not about preference. Those preference changes aren't that dramatic. It's the economic conditions. It's the health conditions. It's the social conditions. It is the political conditions, potentially. So I hope that as you listen to this program and you think about this in your own life and you bring up this conversation at work or in your community or with your family members, that we change this dynamic a little bit. That let's not talk about this in terms of the preferences have somehow changed. It's the reality of people's lives that have changed. It is the conditions of family formation that have changed. It is just harder. It's just harder. You talk to any young person out there today, they'll tell you it's just harder than it used to be to form committed relationships, to raise children, to afford to raise children in a way that that fits the preferences of the way they want to raise those children, and being able to do that at the time of their life that they would prefer to do so. It's a very different lens to look at this issue through. The other thing that I would encourage you to sit back and think about that struck me out of this conversation was the challenge associated with a world where it's so easy to move around and to explore the world, and it's very tempting to simply not settle down. Now, there's plenty of people out there who still want, get married, have kids, focus on your hometown, all that stuff. But does it present a new challenge to the world that you have infinite choices that previous generations didn't have? This blessing could also potentially be a curse, in the sense that if you think that there's always something better for you out there in relationships and in jobs and in economics and in everything else, well, maybe you choose to just keep trying and you never actually pick a partner. Maybe you never pick a country. Maybe you never pick a city. Maybe you just keep floating. Deciding to have children is the ultimate stake in the ground. It's the ultimate decision of we're going to stick together as much as we can as a family, and we're going to pick a community to raise that kid in. Now, that's not true for everybody. There's plenty of people who have kids and travel, but those are the exceptions to the rule. They're not the general rule. And especially in the early years of children's life, unless you're in the military or you have a career that requires you to travel, for the most part, people's preference is to pick a spot, pick a home, get those first few years of child rearing and education, and then potentially there's some movement as the kids get older. We live in a world now where it's just so easy to constantly change your location, change your job, change your country, travel everywhere. It's tempting to simply never put down a stake in the ground anywhere. Does that play a role? We didn't really talk about that necessarily with Lyman. We touched on it a little bit with the issue of location and geography. And then the last point, as we wrap this program up, that I think is important to consider in this topic is this is a global phenomenon. So a lot of times we look at it through the narrow lens of our own families, our own communities, our own friend groups, our own networks. This isn't a conversation that's exclusive to the United States or to a single city or single county or single state within the U.S. It's also not exclusive to countries like Japan that have been dealing with chronic demographic decline now for decades. It's not exclusive to Western Europe or Eastern Europe, Northern or Southern Europe. It's not exclusive to Middle Eastern countries. It's not exclusive to East Asian countries outside of Japan. It is a global phenomenon. And we have very few societal issues that are truly global in nature, where everywhere around the world in very diverse societies, both religious and secular, we're seeing a general movement towards lower rates of fertility. Some of this may be health, but a lot of it seems to be a combination of environmental factors, economic factors, political factors. If that's the case, is this an issue that requires a global policy response? When we think about most politics and most issues that are societal in nature, we think about them at an individual country level. So does the United States, for example, take up a policy to incentivize people to have children, right? That would be a very specific policy for a specific country. Maybe European countries would do something similar. Maybe other countries have done something similar. But what if we look at this from a global perspective, much like climate issues, much like issues of war and peace, much like certain international challenges like keeping shipping lanes open on the high seas? It's possible that we need to start looking at this issue of fertility more at a global level and less at an individual nation level, because it could affect the entire planet. Most of what we talked about today, we tried to keep it global in nature and we wanted to explore the issue. But when we get into policy prescriptions, when we get into the best ideas to help people who want to have kids, this isn't about inducing people who don't already want this. This is about helping people live out their goals and dreams. This is about helping people who already have this in mind achieve what they want. Does this require a global response, and how would we coordinate that? How would we do that? The incentives still have to be at the local level, but can there be an international support system of some kind that makes it a little bit easier to connect people who want families with, frankly, people who need families? You know, Lyman talked about in this episode the example of elderly people living alone who need health care and they don't want to go into an assisted living facility, and young families who can barely afford a one-bedroom apartment. Is there a way to bring those people together, and not just within borders, but potentially across borders? I don't have the answers for these things, but I wanted to share with you the way that I'm thinking about them, and I hope that it sparks some thoughts in your mind. And if it does, I'd love to hear from you. You can always put some comments in my YouTube video on my YouTube channel, Brian J. Matos Podcast. That's my YouTube channel. Just search Brian J. Matos if you're on the YouTube app. You can also find me on any social media platform. You can find my website, brianjmatos.com. You can always email me directly, and I'll read some of your questions on air. That's info@brianjmatos.com. Really appreciate you all taking the time. This was, I think, a meaty episode, hopefully one you'll go back and listen to again, and I'd love to hear from you, and I hope this sparks some conversations in your community. Until next time, this is Brian J. Matos, once again thanking you for listening to this program, and I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.